everyone, and thank you for joining us for addressing the grief of getting sober, understanding the role grief plays in our client's decision to get sober and live a life in recovery. My name is Mia, and I'll be your moderator for this session. There are a few points that I would like to go over to make this experience as smooth as possible. For the entire duration of the event, all attendees by default will be muted and webcams turned off. During the presentation, feel free to use the chat button to ask any questions you might have for the presenter. We will have a designated time during the presentation for those questions to be answered. Please send any technical questions or issues to the moderator through chat. Attendees are free to use the chat to communicate with each other. Please be aware that chats will be seen by all presenters and attendees, so we ask that you keep comments respectful. To receive your CE certificate, you must complete the session evaluation. A link to the session evaluation will be included in your post-session email along with the handouts. Again, this will be sent out 24 hours after the session has ended. On behalf of the TPN Health team, I'd like to say a big thank you to LCA and our presenter, Allison Lindsay Durant, LPC. Allison, you can take it away.
Thank you, Mia. Hi, everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name is Allison Durant, and I am a licensed professional counselor working in the New Orleans area. I got my degree from UNO in 2017 and opened a private practice in January with a focus on grief. I did a lot of my practicum and internship in substance use area, and then after I finished my schooling and got my master's, I worked for 2 years in a long-term residential treatment center. So I have the ability here and opportunity to combine two things that I love, which are substance use and grief. So I'm hoping that what you'll get out of this presentation is to look at a client's recovery journey from the lens of grief. We know that, the relationship that one can have to an addiction, it can be a really strong relationship, and there's a loss when somebody makes a decision to give that up. So I'm going to take two different models to look at getting sober, and then after you make the decision to get sober, what the necessary tasks of mourning are to complete that grieving process. There will be a chance, so since it's kind of in two parts, we will have some time to answer questions in the middle. So if you want to save questions for then or put them in the chat box, that's Mia's department. I don't know what's happening with it. So if there's something that I need to know, I'm sure she'll let me know. Okay, so let's get started. So here's the objectives. I'm going to use Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model to look at a person who is facing a decision to give up their addiction. And then once someone has decided, we're going to use the tasks of mourning, which have been developed by J. William Worden, to process that grief. So as a clinician, learning how to incorporate grieving and mourning into the recovery process and exploring those emotions that are tied to that grief. I'm not sure how many of you all are working in substance use facilities, but I think we can all, as clinicians, agree that we see a lot of substance use disorder as part of a client's process and healing. And so understanding the grief component that comes with losing that addiction, which has been their, confidant, their companion, their best friend, their courage, their everything, and applying the same concepts that we use when we lose a person to death is really what I'm hoping to get across in this presentation. And I do believe, especially with, I hate to even mention it, but COVID-19, it has opened up our eyes to see that there is loss without death. I know that there is a lot of death around COVID-19, but we also experienced a lot of losses that aren't necessarily the death of somebody. So like loss of freedom to go to work, loss of, routine, loss of jobs, loss of relationships. And it has opened up more conversations around how we do grieve these things, even though they're not experiencing a death, which is really great, because I'm hopeful through my work that we do begin to look at grief in a less stigmatizing way, and that we can have conversations about grief. And so looking at a person who is making the decision to recover, or possibly they've come to you and they have recovered, but they're experiencing symptoms of grief, how to help them walk through that process, because there is a loss that is involved. In terms of what that addiction gave them. So first, I just want to cover a couple of definitions. Grieving is what we consider when we talk about the experience of one who has lost a loved one. So in this case, the experience of one who has lost their substance. Mourning is the process that one goes through to adapt to that death. So mourning is sort of post-loss. And then bereavement is kind of all-encompassing, which is the loss to which the person is trying to adapt, and the experience of having lost someone close. So when we look at Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, this was her compelling, groundbreaking work back in 1969 that we have used as a model when we're working with clients in grief. What a lot of people don't realize is that these stages were developed from her work in hospice, sitting with dying patients. So this was what she developed as the things that a dying patient might face before they come to acceptance that they're actually going to die. And it's been used to help manage the process someone goes through, who's grieving a person that died, who's mourning a person that died, which is fine, and she came to terms with before she died. And we know this through, she has a, David Kessler wrote on grief and grieving with her, and he said she never meant for this to be used as a framework for someone who is dealing with a person who died or is dealing with a loss. But she was okay with it by the end. But it's kind of interesting because it does fit very nicely when you think about someone who is facing giving up their addiction. It's the same idea that she had as someone who is facing their death. Now, I'm not going to compare death to addiction, but it's giving up that something, then losing. It's that loss, it's that death that's coming. And so working with a client who is considering giving up addiction, or maybe is being forced or put into treatment, or contemplating it, you can use these stages very easily. The other thing to be aware of is that, even though this is all linear and we sort of talk about them in a sequential order, she also never meant for them to be, okay, after denial comes anger, and after anger comes bargaining. She really, we all know in working with clients that they can go back and forth. So while this is, we have kind of this pattern of the 5 stages of grief, knowing that clients can go in and around, and that no 2 clients are going to grieve the same. So grief really looks like this. It's kind of all over the place. We don't have one way to grieve. You can have family who has lost a father, and they could have 17 kids, and every single one of those children is going to grieve differently. So when we have clients who are coming to us to get sober, or who are contemplating recovery from an addictive behavior, there is no one way that anyone is going to grieve, unfortunately. So, but we can use these stages as a framework, which it fits really nicely. So when we're looking at what she considered the first stage, it's that denial. So it's not me, I don't have a problem. Interestingly, in the beginning of her work, she had called this stage denial or isolation. And isolation has since been dropped. But when you talk about somebody looking at sobriety, isolation can be a huge piece of somebody's uh, life who is in active addiction, because we know that, you know, addiction is here and connection is here. And so being in active addiction is the opposite. So we can tend to see isolation as well as denial. So this whole not me, I don't have a problem, it functions as a buffer for some of the patients to, some of the clients to be able to collect themselves. You know, we talk a lot in treatment centers about all of the different types of denial, the rationalization, the minimization, and we talk pretty extensively about it in a lot of treatment with clients. And basically it's like this place where they can try to find evidence that it's not true. So when you think about her model and how if somebody was told that they had a terminal illness and that they were going to die, it's like this body's reaction, mind's reaction to like, no, this can't be true. So for someone who's facing having to give up their addiction, it's that same kind of like, oh my gosh, my mind is going to try to protect itself. And so denial can set in. And it's actually, you know, not that, it's a way for the client to deal with that uncomfortable prospect of having to give up their substance and their addictive behavior, because it has been serving them. And at some point, you know, it stops serving if they've gotten to the point where they need to get into recovery. But it's kind of that overwhelming feeling of, and reality of the loss. So then it'll gradually give way. But we can have, you know, external judgments and internal judgments that can keep a client in denial. So the second phase is the anger stage. She talks about anger and why me? Like, why me? Why am I the one in treatment? You know, everybody else was drinking just like I was. Why am I in treatment when Uncle Joe's been doing it and still doing it? Why am I, you know, it's like, why me? This anger. And so when denial can no longer be maintained by the client, then anger will set in. Now, again, we can go from anger back to denial, or we could start with anger and then go to denial. So I'm going through these as if they are sequential, but keep in mind that, you know, they're all over the place. So anger is when the denial is no longer serving them, and it can be replaced by feelings of rage, envy, resentment, that we can often see in clients who are not wanting to get sober, or not wanting to give up their addictive behavior. And it can be really difficult to handle from the perspective of a client's family, right? Because oftentimes anger is projected outward. And so understanding that, you know, we want to be able to form alliances with our clients and the therapeutic relationship. And so during this stage of grief, of the possibility of losing, it's important that we, you know, can still sit with the client in those emotions. I'll talk about some techniques after I get through the stages, but it's a really great opportunity. You know, as clinicians, we know that anger is a secondary emotion. And so this stage of grief is a really great opportunity to use that anger iceberg and to explore with the client what the emotions are that are underlying that anger and what the fears are. And so using this stage to do some psychoeducation on what emotions are. How did your family handle anger? You know, really looking at the possibility that the client has no idea what they're feeling. And oftentimes that can be the case. So this stage really is a lot of self-exploration through the guidance of the counselor, and to not just dismiss the anger as something that needs to be managed. One of the things Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was really applauded for was actually sitting with her clients and with the patients in the hospital and hearing them. So really, as clinicians, like hearing what it is that clients are angry about, hearing what it is that they're fearful about, and listening. So that's a really important part. This is really hard when I can't like see what's happening in the audience, by the way. Okay. So the next phase is the bargaining. What if? Those of us who work in recovery or know people who have needed to get sober, or perhaps you're sober yourself, it's like, well, what if I do this? You know, there can be an attempt to postpone the inevitable, to postpone, you know, the death of the addiction, to postpone giving something up that has really been near and dear to you for a long, long time. So what if I do this? What if I only drink on Saturdays? What if I only drink when the sun is down? What if I only go to the casino on Sunday? You know, like bargaining. And so it can be this kind of psychological game that is played with ourselves. And so it's the same idea as when somebody is facing death, as she studied sitting with the patients who are facing dying, like bargaining, like, well, what if I do this, God, will you save me? What if this happens? And so when somebody's facing giving up their addiction, they can begin to bargain. And we see it a lot in treatment and in working with clients, because it can be often this idea of someone else's that they get sober. And so it's like, well, what if I do this? What if I go to counseling? I've had, in private practice, it's been interesting. I have several clients who have come to me instead of going to treatment. So that was their bargaining. Well, what if I go to counseling once a week instead of going to inpatient treatment? Or what if I go to counseling instead of going to AA meetings? Or what, you know, and so I've seen that. So in those cases, you know, we've got to go back to denial, anger, working through these stages to address the grief of giving up the substance. And sometimes that can take a really long time, and that's, you know, that's their journey. So anger, I mean, in bargaining, it's, you know, these plans can be made too, where we have made promises to ourselves, or like silent promises. They aren't always things that are communicated, you know, to others. So the next phase is the poor me. Poor me. I'm the one who has to get sober. I'm the one who doesn't get to go to the bar. I'm the one who's always in trouble, you know, and so it's this depression that sets in. You know, our initial reaction in working with sad people is to try to cheer them up. And, you know, as clinicians, we're aware that it's important to sit with clients in this emotion, in this stage of their grieving process of looking at the possibility of giving up their substance. It's really important that we sit with them and hear them, and, you know, not try to just change their outlook. The techniques that we'll go through will offer a process to help clients assess what they're getting from the substance or what they're not getting from the substance. And in that, using some of these techniques, they will come to their own conclusion. But in this stage, it's usually leading to acceptance. So that sadness hits, the despair hits, the hopelessness, the helplessness. They've used all their resources. And it's kind of like, oh gosh. So this is what Elisabeth Kubler-Ross described before people came into the stage of acceptance. And so going through this sense of depression and feeling sad and helping them emotionally prepare and be supported, is really helpful as from the clinical perspective. So then we get to acceptance. Okay, I want help. I surrender, I'm going to stop fighting, and this is all going to be okay. So this is kind of the what Elisabeth Kubler-Ross calls, the final stage of the grieving process. And in recovery, it is that time at which people are surrendering, for lack of a better word, or they're accepting help. So if a patient has had enough time, if a client has had enough time and they've worked through these stages, then they come to this place of acceptance. Now, not everybody has choices, right? Some people are brought into recovery by powers greater than themselves, like the courts and the, maybe it's the employer, or maybe it's an ultimatum for a relationship. As we see in this kind of second phase, once you've hit acceptance, if the client hasn't fully accepted that they are going to give up this substance or give up this addictive behavior, then they really can't adequately go through the tasks of mourning that substance. So they're stuck in these 5 stages, or they may have to repeat these 5 stages. And as a clinician, it provides a framework for you to look at denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and to look with a client who may be kind of like not sure that this is the thing for them, are really uncertain of losing whatever this addiction is that has been serving them for some period of time. So some of the therapeutic techniques that I like to use in working with clients in these 5 stages of grief, as someone who's considering getting sober and is working to stay sober as well. So the empty chair technique, a lot of us are familiar with that with Gestalt, where the client is able to address a person, a thing, an institution, by speaking directly to the empty chair. This is often helpful if clients are stuck in the anger phase, or if they need to work through those emotions. Using the empty chair is very, very helpful. Another technique that I have found to be very helpful, especially as I was mentioning, seeing clients in private practice whose family members or friends did an intervention and they bargained and came to counseling instead. Or any time that someone is in that bargaining stage or in denial, switching chairs has serves to have the client view himself or herself through the eyes of another family member or another person in their lives. So just sitting in another chair and then describing the situation that perhaps they were observing. And you can use the 5 senses, like have the client tell you what he or she, whoever this person is that maybe they're most angry with, what is it that they saw? what did they think? What did they witness? Because, you know, of course, sitting with the client, a lot of times we're seeing things from one perspective, which is the client telling us this. And it's their perspective, and that's fair. And to help the client see how they were perceived from a different perspective can be really powerful. I've seen that be a successful technique. Another one is who cares, or who do I care about? When I was working in the long-term residential treatment center, we would use this one a lot, and it was really an emotional time because what I would do is just have the clients draw a circle in the middle of a page and put themselves, and then draw spokes off of that circle to identify who they cared about and who was important to them. And it can also be if it's like a family or an institution, but it helps them to see that there is more than just this world that they had become sort of isolated in. And then to do the opposite of who cares about me. That usually brought up a lot of emotion, because somebody who's in active addiction can really use that denial and tell themselves that they aren't impacting anybody, and that what they're doing is nobody's business, and that it doesn't hurt anyone because they're drinking alone in a house, or their, you know, internet use isn't affecting anyone. And so having them draw that picture and then identify people that care about them can be a way to broaden their perspective on how the substance has impacted them and how it's impacted their life. And then that can be used later to work through the emotional pain. Another really helpful technique is a loss timeline. So clients who you're working with who may not be convinced that they are ready to get sober and are ready to give up that substance, it can be really scary for a lot of reasons. And one way that can help the clinician is to understand what are those losses that this client has experienced in their life. So maybe that's what's keeping them from giving this up, because there's some unresolved grief, or maybe their losses were so great that they can't even contemplate the pain that they might experience. So doing a loss timeline is literally just starting from their very first memory to where we are now, and having them identify any and every loss. It can be moving to a new city. It can be loss of a best friend who moved away. Loss of virginity could also be something that's not pleasant. A loss of jobs. I mean, there's some of those obvious losses, and putting, you know, the death of important people. Maybe they got kicked off of a team, and then that's when they started smoking pot. If there's trauma involved, a lot of time that there's loss of childhood. So putting those losses on a timeline can help not just the clinician understand some of what might be a client's apprehension, but it can help the client see how many times they've experienced grief, and how they have actually processed that grief. And what happened when your dog died? Tell me about that. How did your family react? You know, getting an idea of how a client may have processed through any of these losses. Who supported them? Did they have to do it alone? Was it, you know, big boys don't cry, get back out there? Can give you and the client some insight into where they are in giving up this substance, because it's another loss. This substance or the addictive behavior has been serving to either numb or to cope or to lessen anxiety. There's a lot of reasons that people are using. So I think a loss timeline is really important when you're working with clients in in recovery. Another thing is if when you're looking at what their addiction is. So if you ask the client, well, okay, if you didn't have this substance, for instance, what do you think you will miss? And so they're going to tell you some of the positive things. Well, what do you think that you won't miss? Well, I won't miss having to wake up and drink a beer every morning. I won't miss having to get out of bed at 7 a.m. and go find my drug dealer. I won't miss. So helping clients understand what they will miss and what they won't miss is much of what we help clients through who are grieving the death of a person, because it brings it to reality. Because the reality is there's no perfect person out there. So when you're working with the person in grief, to truly grieve, we need to be able to look at the positive sides as well as some of the shortcomings of the person who died. If we're putting them on a pedestal and they were perfect and everything was wonderful, we aren't in reality. And so doing this helps to bring a client into the reality of the loss. So journaling, I think, is always, as a counselor, we use journaling a lot. I think it's really, really helpful. As someone who is facing the possibility of getting sober, and writing letters can be really helpful. They can write a letter to their addiction. They can write a letter to loved ones that may have cut them off and not speaking to them. They can write a letter to the police force who, jailed them fairly or unfairly. They can write a letter to their counselor that they're angry with them. They can write all kinds of letters and not send them. I cannot emphasize enough. I always feel like I have to put a big red sign up when I ask a client to write a letter, and I'm like, please do not mail this letter. And every once in a while they're like, yeah, well, I mailed that letter. Like, oh gosh, okay. So it's kind of tricky, but it can be really therapeutically beneficial. So I guess at this time, I will ask if anyone has any questions. And Mia,
Hello.
hi.
Right here. So you can enter them in the chat function below in your control panel, and I will relay the questions to Allison. So we have a couple that said, hello, looking forward to a great presentation. And someone said you're doing great when you mentioned that you couldn't see them.
Oh, thank you.
So yes.
All right, so no questions.
I have not gotten any yet. If you want to wait one more minute or not, we can
No, that's okay. I'll keep going.
Okay.
Okay, so I hope I'm not putting everybody to sleep. It is lunchtime, so maybe everybody's eating their lunch and they don't have their hands on the keyboard.
I did get one question just now. I'd like to hear it. Are some people successful doing treatment privately versus inpatient?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. Now, I can't speak to long term. I have no clinical data, but I can tell you anecdotally that, for instance, clients that have come to me privately in lieu of going to treatment have remained sober. The thing about treatment that you're going to get, which you're not going to get privately, unless in the case of a client that I'm working with, he's being tested by friends and family, but I'm not going to test them. So I'm taking their word that they are sober. Whereas if you're in treatment, you will be tested and held to that standard.
We have another one that says, what are the downsides of actually sending a letter versus not sending?
Oh, the downsides of sending a letter versus not sending. That oftentimes the letters are very direct, and can spark defensiveness in the person that's receiving the letter. And so writing a letter and sending it without working through, what I like to do is to work with clients to see what their part is in this anger. And so oftentimes our initial reaction is to write a letter to blame and to project. And so it's not, if it's a relationship that the client is wanting to repair, it's going to cause somebody to become defensive as opposed to receptive. And so writing the letter is therapeutically beneficial just because you're putting pen to paper without sending it out to the recipient. So you're going to get the therapeutic benefit from it without sparking some sort of reaction in the other person. And eventually a letter can be sent if that's what the person is desiring. But it's just initially, if someone's looking at getting sober and they're not really too happy about it, writing that letter can be destructive to the relationship. I mean, sending the letter can be destructive to the relationship. Writing it is fine, but sending it can be destructive.
Great. I have another one. What common traits come up for you when you are processing the loss of fun with your clients?
What common traits come up when you're processing fun?
The loss of fun.
Oh, wow. That's a good question. And I think that comes into denial, and where we talk about like what we will miss versus what we won't miss. And kind of like, what's your idea of fun, you know? And so it comes into sort of that reality testing and denial that there is a problem. And so a lot of times, like if you're working in a 12-step program, they talk about unmanageability. And so while there can be fun, well, what areas of your life are unmanageable? Is it hard to get out of bed and show up for work? Is throwing up, you know, from 2 a.m. till 8 a.m, what you call fun? So that's a very good question, because for a lot of people, their addiction does provide fun. And so when we talk about the second phase of like, once you've given up the addiction, how do you incorporate and move on in life without it? That's where we'll talk about coming up with other support factors and filling that space with something that's a healthier choice.
And I have one more. I work at a PHP-IOP clinic, and I'm interested in learning how I can utilize this with my population, especially with the short time period we have to work with them.
I think the loss timeline would probably be the best thing to do with a client in a short period of time, because it's going to give you insight into the amount of grief and loss that the client may already be experiencing before they're having to consider giving up their substance.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions. Okay. Is that it?
Yes, that's it so far.
All right. Thank you. Okay. So the second part of my presentation is, so we're going through the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. The client has made the decision to get sober. What J. William Worden, he's written a book, Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy, and this is like his 4th edition. It's for clinicians to work with clients on the tasks of mourning. So this is when someone has died, this is what has been considered the necessary tasks that someone must go through to fully grieve a person. And so when we look at the substance, like, okay, if you're working with a client who's given up a substance, understanding like well, it's not all over then, right? Life is beginning in a different way. And so the very first task is accepting the reality of the loss, which is the last stage of the stages of grief. So in either way, if they're not in acceptance, we're going to have to go back to those stages of grief. And then the second task is working through the pain of the grief. And this is really the biggest chunk for us as clinicians to work with clients on, because that's the part that I like. The reason I'm excited about doing this presentation is because really sitting with the client and working through all of those emotions that come with the loss of that addiction and any other losses that they may have had that have not been processed, because it comes into that question of, well, what came first, the loss or the addiction? And so exploring that with the client is really a big chunk of this process. And then adjusting to the new environment, which speaks to the person's question about fun. Well, what's going to be fun if I can't go out and drink with my friends and wreck a car and run from the police, or, pop 2 tires? And, every story begins with, oh my God, we were so loaded, and so how am I going to adjust to this environment? And then in relocating the deceased, which in this case is your addiction, and moving on. So accepting the reality of the loss, some things to look for are if the client, so maybe you get a client who's gotten sober, and they are sort of still in that place of not really sure. Maybe they're doing marijuana maintenance, or they're, rationalizing their use. They may need to go back to denial and go back to working with the client on the denial and the minimization, and really looking more at what it is that they think that they're getting from the substance versus what will they miss and what won't they miss. Another thing is to really pay attention to intellectual versus emotional acceptance, because I have many clients who can come in here and tell me very factually about things, but there's no emotion behind it. And so it's this, like, well, yeah, she died, but she was a terrible person. And so when we're using this in substance use to apply it to, yeah, well, I used to have a problem, I don't have a problem anymore. And there's no emotion attached to their use, or what the patterns of behavior were, or what the emotions were that they were trying to deal with. Making sure that there is some sort of emotional component so that you can feel like they're in like acceptance, that they're no longer just in, for lack of a better word, shock, that they're actually going to have to stay sober to achieve long-term sobriety, if that's their goal. The other thing is that they can make the abstinence like less significant. They can minimize it and make it not seem all that big of a deal. Or there can be this selective forgetting. That can happen a lot when we deal with clients who may have had a substance use problem. They forget about the bad parts. They forget about the destruction. They forget about missing work. They forget about letting people down. And so paying attention in that area to help them accept the reality. Well, there's selective forgetting, sorry. So this is the second task, is to work through the pain of the grief. And as I was mentioning, this is really, really where the crux of grieving that addiction comes in. Because we know as counselors, part of our job is to help people feel. And really, we have such a crisis in that many people just don't know how to feel. They don't know what they're feeling, or they may feel, but they feel like, I don't know what this is. And so tying all of the emotions into a loss, such as getting sober, is really the work of the counselor here. So knowing that not everyone's going to experience the intensity of the pain or feel it the same way, but people who give up their addiction are often unprepared to feel the feelings, the sheer force of the feelings, and the nature of the emotions. So this can be twofold or triple fold or quadruple fold, but not only are we going to have the pain of losing the substance, we're also going to have the pain of just feeling emotions because we no longer are numbing out. And so they talk about the analogy that I've heard that I like, is that when we're in addiction, when we're in active addiction, it's like we're driving a truck and we're going down the road and we're eating Wendy's and we just like crumple up the bag and we throw it in the bed of the truck and we keep going and we just keep crumpling it up and throwing it in the bed of the truck. And pretty soon we have all this trash in the back of the truck. And when we stop drinking, using, or whatever the behavior is, we slam on the brakes and all that trash just comes crashing in. And so for someone who's been using their addiction to numb out, the pain can be so intense. And then you've also got the brain chemistry piece because now they're not using substances to get their dopamine and serotonin. So pain and emotions are really, really intense when someone is getting sober, and they might be feeling for the very first time. And for those of you that work in treatment and with people with substance use, you'll often hear them like, oh, I didn't cry at my grandmother's funeral, and then now I can't stop crying. I can't stop crying. And so that's just one example of the emotions that can come once you have given up that substance. And that is a lot of what can keep people using, is the pain and the fear of feeling those feelings. And so working through this with the client is a really, really important piece. So to help you work through the pain of the grief, we're going to look at a lot of different areas. So one of them is the nature of the attachment. So how much, how frequently, what's the intensity. So we have, anyway, so the frequency, the duration, how intense, how did they have, like, what do they have ambivalence toward using the substance? For some people, their addiction becomes just to maintain status quo. So I'm not drinking to get drunk. I'm just drinking so I don't go into shaking and withdrawal and, unable to function. It's not that I'm getting this high anymore. I'm not using heroin, for instance, to get high. I'm just using it so that I don't go into withdrawal. And so looking at what their nature of the attachment is really important. And then also, what kind of conflicts have they had? Meaning, how many times have they tried to get sober? What has been their story on their relapse journey? What has worked? What hasn't worked? And then also, like, the dependent relationships that they may have. Who will this impact? Because whatever this, like when you talk about fun, it's like, oh, well, this links me to this activity, or it links me to this group of people, or it links me to how am I going to work when everybody is leaving after work and going in and getting high or drunk. So what's the nature of the attachment that the client is actually looking at losing? Because that's going to help explain and explore the intensity of the pain that they might feel around that. The second thing is understanding how someone is going to grieve. So this is where the loss timeline can come in handy, because looking at what their losses are and really seeing if there's unresolved grief or how they have grieved a loss in the past. That's going to help give you, as the counselor, some idea of how they may grieve this loss. So if they were like, Oh yeah, we buried him and it was fine, or if they were like, oh my God, my dog died and I couldn't get out of bed for a week and I had to call, it's going to tell you a little bit about how the person is going to handle the emotions which come from losing this substance and losing this, because it's not just losing the substance, it's losing the substance and the life that they had with it. Personality variables. So this is things like age and gender. What if a 19-year-old is looking at getting sober or recovering from an addiction, it can look very different than if you have a 70-year-old who's considering getting sober. What's their coping style? Are they more like problem solving or do they avoid it? What's their attachment style? Do they have secure attachments or insecure attachments? What's their cognitive style? Meaning, do they look at the world as being the glass is half full, or do they look at the world as the glass is half empty? How do they see things? Because this is going to help you as the counselor come to approach and also to build that therapeutic relationship with the client who's processing this loss. What's their ego strength? So do they have high self-esteem? Are they, a person who's got to have control? Are they internal versus external locus of control? Really exploring that aspect of it too. And then also, what are their beliefs and values? Like what gives them meaning? Exploring that can be really helpful too. So the other thing is the social variables. When someone's looking at getting sober, what are the social variables that we need to take a look at to help this client be successful? And also to help understand what some of the painful emotions are that might accompany this decision to get sober and to live a life in recovery, because there's the perceived social variables. Like you may come from a family where it's like, what do you mean you're not going to drink? That is insane. Or if you had emotional support from someone who is possibly not a healthy relationship for you. Where are you going to get support to help you work through the pain of the grief? There are studies that show with the social variable piece that for clients who seek support through others, there is less depression. It doesn't mean it's going to speed up their process. It just means that there's less depression, which makes sense. And, with the 12-step programs, that's one of the things that it provides very well is fellowship and that feeling of you don't have to do this alone. And so it can help a client work through those emotions and through the pain of getting sober and the pain of losing that substance and starting to live a new life. That's where there's not just 12-step programs. There's a lot of programs that are available, but working with clients to connect is really important. So, getting involved in something, whether it be a religious activity or a club of some sort. So what are those social variables? In this case, when you're working through the client, like, what is it that they're going to be losing though? Like, am I not going to be able to go play softball every Thursday because everybody is, you have to do it with a drink in hand or whatever it is. So what are those things that this client might be feeling the pain of losing because of sobriety or recovery? You, as the counselor, need to also explore the cultural variables. So what is it culturally that is the norm? How is it in their, culture, in our culture, what is expected when we grieve something or someone, or what's not allowed, what is allowed? Like, how does that work? Interestingly, in our culture in the United States, it was at one point we would mourn the death of a person for 1 year, and the community would support and provide support through community, but that process of grieving got sped up when the flu hit and people were dying at a more rapid rate, and then also World War I. And somehow we've gotten to where we have 3 days of bereavement leave, and then you're supposed to be like ready to move on. And we know now that that's just not adequate. And so grieving the loss of this life that the person thought that they had, it's not going to be a really quick thing. And depending on their culture, they may have different rituals around grief. And so really understanding and exploring that can be helpful, because how could they use it? The last thing is to look at what else is going on in this client's life. So for a client who's looking at recovery, what else has happened? What are the other painful experiences or losses that might be taking place? Maybe they're also dealing with loss of a job, loss of a relationship, exploring those losses and working through the pain of those, of that grief as well. So it's really, this is a really chunky piece of addressing grief in recovery and using the model that J. William Worden uses when we're working with someone who has a loved one that has died. It's the same, these tasks still apply to someone who is looking at recovering, because there is this idea that they've had to lose this coping mechanism and this thing that has served them and the life that they had. And so it becomes really, can be very compounded, especially if there has not been any way to process through the pain. And as I mentioned before, you know, substance use and addiction is a way of numbing out. So the intensity of the emotions in this phase of someone's recovery can be very, very similar to grief and the feelings that come with losing someone. So the next task is to begin to adjust to the reality in which you don't have the substance. So you're going to want to look at externally, internally, and then spiritually. So externally would be things like people, places, and things. So exploring with your client what people, places, and things are going to be healthy versus unhealthy. And there, you know, is this process again of like, okay, I've got to adjust and I'm giving up these things, and that can feel very much like grief. And it is grief because you are losing these things, but helping the client build the external things. So maybe that softball league where you have to play with a drink in your hand isn't the one for you. I'm sure there's another one where they play softball and they don't do that. Helping clients find externally things that they can do to build this life that's in recovery. Internally, this is where you can explore things with the client about like a mindfulness practice or an exercise routine or a gratitude practice to help adjust to the life in recovery. So instead of filling the void with the addictive behavior, how am I going to get these dopamine, serotonin rushes through things that I can do on my own? Spirituality is a big piece in 12-step programs. And you don't have to use 12-step programs to get spirituality. There's also, and you don't have to have spirituality to recover, but there's a lot of options out there. There's smart recovery, there's Dharma recovery, there's celebration, there's if you are you know, finding a different support group. There's a lot of things that can help provide support. But in this task, adjusting to the reality, the counselor is doing a lot of problem solving with the client. So if externally, oh my God, there's no way I can go to Thanksgiving dinner with my family, then let's problem solve. So with the counselor, we may have to work on coming up with other alternatives. they talk about in recovery not to make any major decisions or to put yourself in a position of being triggered for a year. They say the same thing when someone has lost a loved one. Do not make any major decisions within the first year. And just like we can have triggers to relapse in substance use, we can have triggers, we can have grief triggers. So really working diligently with your client to develop an environment that's healthy. So looking externally, looking at the internal, the mindfulness piece, exercise, self-care, diet. We know that those things can help in overall well-being, like taking a holistic approach can help. And so as the counselor doing that problem solving, this is a lot of what happens in this phase of somebody who's looking to get sober. So then the final task is to emotionally relocate the addiction and move on. So in this as the final task, and really, are we ever done? No, we're never done. But it's putting the addiction in a place where it's no longer like the thing, and it's now become a part of who we are. This is obviously taken from a model of someone who's dealing with death of a loved one. So death of a loved one, eventually those extreme waves of pain and grief begin to subside, and we're able to put that person within us and carry them forward. So that's what happens when someone has gotten some sobriety and is moving through these tasks, is they don't forget it. They don't get over it. It just becomes a part of who you are. And so in this, it's like looking at forgiving versus forgetting, because for a lot of clients who may have been in addiction and hurt people, it's, forgive yourself and be able to live in a way that is healthy going forward. Again, 12-step programs have an amends process that helps clients to work through that forgiveness piece. But really it's not about forgetting, because it's just like if we lost a loved one, we don't want to forget them. You want to remember what it was like when you were using, because that's how you can remember to stay sober. And when you work in part of a 12-step program is also to share your experience with people, but you don't even have to be in a 12-step program to do that. So it's not about forgetting, but it is about forgiving. Finding a recovery community, this can help a lot in not only the fellowship piece, but in being in a spot where you're giving back. The spirituality piece is also a way that a lot of people have found serenity and peace in handling the painful emotions that can come with grief. And then finding meaning. David Kessler, who studied with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, he wrote a book called The Sixth Stage of Grief, and it's finding meaning. So how do we find meaning in what we just went through? When you think about where I started, right, with denial, and then now we've gone through all of these stages and all of this pain and the tasks of mourning, and I'm like, okay, it sounds exhausting. And so how do I find meaning in all of this? And it may not be something that a client can come to immediately. It's something that just sort of is part of the exploration with the counselor and with themselves to begin to set personal goals and begin to look to the future and to make plans. So some of the therapeutic techniques in these tasks are similar to what we've already talked about. So the loss timeline is really important, because using that to really, in the second task where you're working through the pain of the grief, that's where you're going to be doing a lot of work on losses, because if they have unresolved grief, it's going to need to be addressed in that part of the process. So again, journaling, writing letters, what will I miss, what won't I miss, problem solving and setting goals are added in this phase. So those are the stages of grief for somebody getting sober, and then what the tasks of mourning are. And you can apply those if you have a client who's experiencing a death as well. But in looking at it as the grief of losing that substance and that life that they had built and the relationship that they had with the addiction. Here's a list of common feelings that come with grief. And I don't think any of these are very surprising, but a couple of them that I really wanted to focus on were grief and depression, because they can look very similar. And so, as I mentioned, in, getting sober, the brain chemistry is changing. So understanding where we may need to address depression versus what's a normal grief response with the client. So both are going to share sleep disturbances, appetite disturbances, and some intense sadness. But in a grief reaction, there is not the loss of self-esteem that you can find in depressions. In a grief reaction, it's more about the world looking poor and not that the person feels poor and empty. Now, often when someone is getting sober, as I mentioned, like anger towards yourself can come into play, and understanding that, number one, they may be feeling feelings for the first time in a very long time. And number two, they're not getting, their brain chemistry is depleted because they're no longer getting that substance. So sometimes it's important to have an evaluation for medication because they have been depleted. And so getting their brain chemistry to a place where they get a little bit of dopamine and serotonin can help increase their chances of long-term recovery. And it may be, we don't know, or maybe there is a study, but it's curious if, it's like, well, did people have low dopamine and serotonin and then they started using, and that's where the addiction came in? It's like that may have been their temperament and their place before they started using substances. We don't know, but it's important to be aware of the reality of depression when somebody does come in and get sober, and making sure that we do refer that out for an evaluation. And, some clients feel like, look, I got sober. There is no way I'm taking medication. I deserve to be, medication free. I'm so tired of taking pills. And, the way that I work with clients on that is that a lot of things that are happening in getting sober are temporary. So we know that, emotions are temporary. This situation of not being with your family might be temporary. There's a lot of things that are temporary. And so if I explain the brain chemistry and the depletion of the chemicals in the brain, and just explore the possibility of using medication if a psychiatrist thinks that would be necessary, it can help provide the client with a more successful outcome, because if they're feeling a little bit better, then they are going to feel more motivated to stay sober, as opposed to, this is terrible, I'd rather be, drunk or high. So anxiety is very often part of someone's recovery or grief process. And this is from C.S. Lewis. I'm sure a lot of y'all are familiar with the book, but he said, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear." So when you think about somebody getting sober and now they have lost their crutch, their best friend, their companion, their entertainment, their everything, it can be very anxiety inducing to think about what life would look like without it. And so anxiety is that underlying fear. So really being aware of it and working with clients to process what the fear is and helping make a game plan using that external, internal, spiritual of like, what will my life look like? How can I build a life that's worth living? Really doing the work with the client to break it down to help lessen the anxiety. So what can the client gain control of? What can the client use to cope? Giving those skills to the client is really, really important if you see them in this, in working through their recovery process, if anxiety starts to cover up, because a lot of times it will. And then the last thing is guilt. Very rarely do we have grief without guilt. Anger can be turned inward and become guilt. And so if, I mentioned in a 12-step program, they do a good job of working with doing the amends process and seeing your part in things. And so for those of you that are familiar with it, it's a really good way to work with clients through guilt. But also helping reframe what the client's experience is into a healthier message and core belief. But knowing that, I mentioned guilt because I think that it's a really important piece to normalize for clients and to assure them that it's a very normal reaction to their experience, because you're not going to see very many people who have grief responses that don't have guilt. But it is something to be addressed with the client. So when is mourning finished? Those of us that are working with clients in recovery, or if you're working with clients in grief, mourning is never finished. The good news about working with clients in recovery is that, it's a disease. And I often, none of that was mentioned in this presentation, but, the loss of this substance and the grief and the emotions that go along with it, we are going to take that experience and carry it with us, just like we would the love or the pain of losing someone. It's a part of who we are. And so the mourning process is never finished. We get it to a place where it's not defining us, and it's not holding us back, but it's something that we take along our journey. And so assuring clients that that's part of their process and that's part of their story, and that they have the opportunity, to write the rest of it. And so write meaning W-I-R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T, the rest of their story. But that there's going to be times where there's triggers and where grief emotions are triggered as well. But assuring everyone that that's a very normal part of the journey. And with that, Freud, from the infinite words of Freud, I leave you with this slide. And that is it. Does anybody have any questions?
Again, attendees, you can put them in the chat box below and I'll relay them to Allison.
I guess I can stop sharing, is that right?
Yeah. And again, just want to remind the attendees that you will receive this PowerPoint in the post-session email along with your evaluation. Someone said, great presentation, thank you.
Thank you. I hope it was helpful.
have people saying wonderful presentation. Someone said you've been the best presenter so far.
What? Wow, thank you. Is this your first one? No, I'm just kidding.
You did great.
Thank you.
Great perspective and gives me a new awareness. Useful information, very insightful. Really interesting and strong content. So a lot of praise.
Wow, I'll take that. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for attending.
And the person who said you were the best presenter so far responded and said, no, actually licensed 11 years. So,
Wow.
so if attendees don't have any questions, oh, wait. Oh yeah, someone said I do substance abuse evaluations for court and this is helpful.
Oh, good. Thank you.
A lot of praise from the attendee. Glad to hear. So did you want to wait a little longer, Allison, for some more questions if they come in?
No, I'm good. My Q&A is lit up. I don't know if that matters.
Oh yeah, someone said enjoyed.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I actually did have someone who asked if you could write the author and book name in chat. So I know you mentioned a couple books.
Oh, yeah. So it's Jay. It's an expensive book, and I'm not sure why, but if you do any work in grief or recovery, it is J. William Worden, Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy. Now, this is the 5th edition, but he has other editions which may be less expensive. And then Claire Bidwell Smith.
I'm just rewriting it so they can.
Oh, thank you.
Great. So attendees in the chat, we've both written the names of 2 books that Allison has mentioned and referred to. So have that for yourselves.
All right.
All right. And on behalf of TPN Health, thank you, Allison, for this great presentation today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed doing it. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. And just a reminder, attendees, in order to receive your CE certificate, you must complete the post-session evaluation that will be sent out 24 hours after the session ends. We hope you keep enjoying the last day of LCA conference. To access more sessions, you can go back to the sessions hall with your access link. Thank you so much and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Mia.
Of course, bye, Allison.